You can forget a lot of things, Foster Care Nation, but never forget this. You're listening to Unparalleled Studios.
I signal.
Foster Care Nation, listen up. This is
Foster Care and Unparalleled Journey.
Strength for the powerless, courage for the fearful, hope and healing for wounded hearts. Hello and welcome back to Foster Care, an Unparalleled Journey with Jason and no Amanda again. Life's getting us, guys, so yeah, you're just gonna have to wait to hear from her for a little while because, well, babies are more important than hanging out with me apparently. So she's doing the adult thing and feeding baby right now. So I brought you today Miss Michelle McGough. How are you doing today, Michelle?
Very well, thank you.
Now, we haven't dove real deep into your story, but I know that you are an adoptee.
Yes, that's right.
How did you come to that? Did you come through the foster system, or was it something that where you were adopted at birth, or how did you end up in that system?
I was adopted in the 1970s in Minnesota, and at that time, the way adoptions worked, even if a child was given up at birth, if there were some arrangements already made, there was an opportunity for the mother to change her mind, and she had 16 weeks to do that. So before the child was placed with the adoptive family, the child would go into foster care for those 16 weeks. So that was my scenario. I had already been arranged to be adopted, but I still had to go to foster care.
Wow, I did not realize that they did it that way. I'm just going to say that sounds like a horrible idea in my mind. You know, that first time, 16 weeks, you said?
Yes, 16 weeks.
That's an important time.
It is. And the way that whole first part of my life went down, I didn't find out about this until I was in my 30s and found my birth parents. I knew that I had been in foster care because there was some information in the house, some records about it. And also later, I think when I was 4 or 5, my adoptive parents wanted to adopt another child. And so the foster care organization did a home visit. And so that was kind of reinforced. I knew that was part of the process.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, did you always know that you were adopted? Was that part of your story from childhood, or was that something that you found out later on?
I didn't remember being told. So I was made aware of it early enough that I didn't experience an event where I thought that I was the natural child of those two people and then was surprised. It was something that I'd always known.
Now, I'm always curious, how is that, or has it played a role in your life? You're obviously not a 5-year-old girl anymore, right? You're an adult now, and you can, how has that played a role in the woman that you've become?
Well, if it's all right, I can tell you a bit about my adoption and how that happened and came to be. And then I'd love to tell you how that impacted me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I was conceived by a couple of teenagers, not a new story. I think we've heard that one several times. So when I was born, my parents were 17 and 18, and they were not married. My mother was disowned by her family unless she gave the child up for adoption. So that was kind of the deal. And she had thought about starting a life with this man, but he was quite abusive to her when I was in utero. So she decided that it would be safer for the both of us if she left him and then gave me up for adoption. When I was born, and I didn't find this out until my 30s, like I said, when I met my birth parents. When I was born, the hospital kind of screwed up. So the process at the time was if a child was meant to be adopted out, that the adoption agency, and I was adopted through Catholic Charities, that the adoption agency would receive the baby, that the baby wouldn't be brought to the mother after birth. But the hospital messed up and brought me to her. And, we bonded. That was the way that she described it. She was holding me and kind of changing her mind and thinking, actually, I want to keep this baby. Maybe there's something I can work out with my parents. But then the adoption agency came and told her that she had signed her rights away, that the deal was done. There was nothing she could do. And, she was a teenager. She didn't read through the contract. She didn't know that she had that time to change her mind. So they took me from her. And in some way, I still remember that wound, that time of being really loved, and then just being separated. And then at the same time, that came along with also a sense of rejection, and then I don't really know what went on in foster care, but by the time I arrived with my my adoptive family, it really wasn't a good situation. They didn't really want to be parents. I'd ask them, why did they decide to adopt a child? Because they never seemed to be very enthusiastic about parenthood, ever. And they had told me that they had tried to conceive for 8 years and were unsuccessful. And they were embarrassed when people asked them why they didn't have any children. So they adopted me apparently to stop being embarrassed by the question of, why did you decide not to have children? Yeah, maybe not a good motivational story there. But it's real. I mean, that's just what happened. So these two people who didn't really maybe want to be parents also had alcohol problems. They had problems with food. Both of them were obese. They were both quite depressed and, sad people. And so I grew up with kind of a multiplier. I had the rejection and the separation from my birth experience. And then I lived with these people who didn't really want me. So I couldn't figure out why would they adopt me? They didn't seem to want me. I always seemed to be a disappointment to them. And, then they were always depressed and sad. So I grew up really with a sense of never having felt love, except maybe for those first, moments right when I was born. And I think it was those moments when I was being held by my birth mother that I actually felt love. And that's what kept me going, because it was a pretty dark household to grow up in.
Yeah. I hate to have to talk about these sorts of things, but it's real. And not every adoptive family is the best choice, and not every foster family is the best choice. I've heard enough stories. I remember as a kid, the one story I remember having heard about the foster system, it was on the news. I remember seeing a news, like a 60-minute deal. So it was an extended news story, and it was a double wide somewhere in Kentucky or Arkansas or somewhere in the South. And they literally had like dog cages that they kept kids in. And I remember thinking, like, even as a kid, I heard that story and I'm like, huh? Like, what? And as I got older, I found, that there are people who not here where I live in Missouri, because you can't do it for money here. But because they don't give that kind of money out, but people who try to do it just for money to make their money from the government by doing that. And I don't know, I think you have to be a special kind of a horrible human to do that for money. And, but people do things for the wrong reason all the time. And it sounds like that was not only a problem that they suffered with, but something that you suffered with as well.
Yeah, that's true. Not having a sense of love or belonging really anywhere. That was quite difficult. And that attitude about myself really impacted my life outside of the home too. I was always looking for someone, to love me, someone who wanted me. And so when I was in school, I tried so hard to get, someone to like me. And I worked really hard to get the praise from my teachers. And that was one thing I did well. Academics went well for me, but having a sense of not belonging, having a sense of no self-worth was something that, you can't really see it on a person, but it seems like people who have that sensibility are always the victims of bullies, the children who get picked on or humiliated or abused. I was that child. I was the child that was always the butt of all the jokes. Even some teachers would pick up on that unconsciously and would do that. And so, by the time I was maybe 11 or 12, I was suicidal. I also developed, an eating disorder. I really didn't have anything good in my life, and it wasn't until I got into high school where I found a possible place that I could go. So I went to public school, and in Minnesota, in public school, at least in my district, all of the kids, I think in either 10th or 11th grade, had to take the ASVAB. Do you remember that test? The military.
I remember the ASVAB.
The ASVAB. So that's a military kind of a skills test. It's a test to see, if someone were to enlist, what value could they bring? What could they be doing? And all of the kids that had, not all of them, but many of the kids that I knew that already had college plans didn't take the test seriously. They just filled out C, for all the answers and walked out because for them it didn't matter. But I had no plans. There were no plans for me. All I knew is that there wasn't going to be any money for college because my parents just basically said I had to get out when I was 18. So I didn't really understand what the test was for, but I turned out to have done very well on it. And so recruiters started coming for me. And even though I was a little bit overweight, I wasn't overweight enough where the recruiters thought that I wouldn't be able to make it in basic. So the recruiter that kind of chased after me the most was an Army recruiter, and it felt nice to be wanted for something. So I followed through with that and I enlisted.
They did the same thing to me.
Yeah.
And then they gave me the D-Lab. Are you familiar with the D-Lab?
I don't recall the D-Lab. You might have to remind me.
That's a defense language aptitude battery. Basically, they're testing you for your ability to speak foreign languages.
Oh, they may have. When I went to select my occupation, these guys have it. They just have it. I say guys, but I'm sure there are lady recruiters too. But they have it all figured out. They've got it down to a science. They have, they give you like 3 options, and there's one they really want you to take, and then they give you a couple options that don't seem quite as good. But the other options always have bonuses. So like either way, the recruiter's coming out all right. And language school, that was one of the things that was offered to me. But I was afraid to go. I think it was where was the school? Was it Monterey? It was somewhere in California.
Monterey, California.
Monterey.
It's a Presidio at Monterey.
That's right. And it was 2 years. And I was afraid to commit to 2 years of just the training. So I took something that was half that. So I took an electronics role. And that had, I think, maybe 11 months of training. So with basic, it ended up being just a little bit over a year.
Yep, yeah. You must have done well on the D-Lab because I know enough to know that sounds like you scored high enough to get selected to Cat 4 language, and that's where I was. So yeah, I'm not going to say you made a terrible choice, but I had a good time out there at Monterey.
Yeah, I always wonder what would have happened to me, but when I play out the things that I would have done with a foreign language, it always lands me to a place that probably wouldn't have been a good choice for me in the long run. So no regrets.
Yeah, it's useless for me now. I mean, honestly, they trained me in Korean, and so I'm not there's not a lot of use for that for me. And seeing as it's been more than 20 years, I remember just enough to say hi, order a beer, and ask where the bathroom is. That's what I can still do clearly. Actually, I took my family out to a little Korean restaurant here in the St. Louis area one night, and I'd seen it before, and it had Korean kanji on, hanji on the building that said Hangbuk Sikbom, and I knew that was a restaurant. So I took my family there, and we walked in, and we are the only non-Asian people in the place, and it was a really kind of a strange feeling. It was like almost felt like you were in the Godfather setting. Like there was a table with the older guy, and people would come in and talk to him, and it was kind of weird, and everybody looked at us funny. And the poor waitress came over, and she struggled so hard to come up with English to talk to us. And when I broke into Korean with her, like you could have knocked her over with a feather, because I don't look like your standard Korean speaking person. But yeah, it's one of the few places that served me, because we got amazing food there. Because I don't know if you've ever messed around with any of the Asian food options out there, but the Koreans know how to cook. It's all I'm saying. They know how to make some amazing food.
Oh, yes, they do. It's some of the best food on the planet. Like it's basically meat and vegetables and rice, and the flavor profiles are so complex, and they tend to not be as sweet as some of the other Asian cuisines. And so I find that really appealing. It's very hearty. It's excellent winter food. But they also have dishes that are nice in summer too, like the cold noodles. Making me hungry.
Yeah, that's as much as it has served me. And my son, when he joined the military, he went, and they kind of tried to do the same thing with him that you're describing. And I told him, I said, son, do what your old man did. Go go serve your country if that's what you want to do, and allow that your training to serve you when you get out. And he's been out for a few years now, and he now makes almost the same money that I make, having worked at the company I'm at for 15 years, been in the industry for 20 years, and he makes comparable money because he got all that paid for by the Army, and he can go out into the real world and use that. So it's been amazing for him. So yeah, it's been that's been a good experience. I think both of us had a decent experience through that whole thing. But yeah, so I think when you talk about having men in the military, because I was there, like that's a family unto its own.
It is. I mean, I went into the reserves. So again, I had so many fears. I was so afraid to commit to something. I just wanted to get out of that house. And I knew if I didn't get out on my own terms, I was going to get out on their terms. So meaning my adoptive parents. So I got out, and I went into basic, and then went into my AIT. And wherever you go, there you are, Jason. So it didn't really solve a lot of my problems going into the military. I still had an eating disorder, and it actually got a lot worse because you're weighed all the time. And, even though I did okay with physical fitness, there's still a, height and weight scale that you have to be within. So I struggled a lot there, and my eating disorder got rampant. It was really bad. And walking around with low self-worth in any organization, including the military, is it doesn't go away, and I didn't have the maturity to know what was going on or what was wrong with me. I just knew there was something off about me that I didn't see when I grew up. I grew up in a fairly, we didn't have a lot of money, but I grew up in a fairly affluent community. So I went to school with people that most of them had both of their parents, which does seem to help people, succeed and do a bit better and have, better self-esteem and self-worth. But when I got to the military, as someone enlisted, and being around basically only enlisted people, I met a lot of people that had, I would say, a lot more problems in life than what I saw in my community when I was growing up. A lot of the people there, this was their only choice. They didn't have any other choices. It was their best option. And so it was a lot more of a rough, I would say a much more rough community of people that I was not prepared for. And I came out rougher for it. It took me a while to recover from that.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah. Because as much as I appreciate the fact that today's American culture appreciates their veterans much more than they used to, I know that having been in the military, when people talk about how veterans are all amazing, I'm like, I met a few like that. I don't know if you want to call them that amazing, right? They were there because it was their last option, and they maybe weren't the most amazing humans. So they're not all the most amazing people, and so you end up with kind of that collection of people, and who you end up around makes a big difference, and just like in every other part of your life. um so and so much of who we become goes back to those childhood experiences, and I know that now. I didn't know that then. I know that now, and I look at that and I see people who struggle through things in their 40s and 50s and through their whole life sometimes, that goes back to some family of origin issues. So as you look back across your life, that mother and father wound for having lost both of your parents of your first family, has that been a driving factor in some of the struggles you've had?
Certainly, there was a lot of abuse in that household too, and I would say that was probably the number one impact in terms of what was on the surface going on with me. Um, but having missed out on a good familial relationship with mother and father certainly impacted me too. I definitely was always looking for a father figure, and I didn't know that. Even in my career, I can look back and see patterns, probably in the first 2/3 of my technical career, where I was working for the same unavailable man that my father was. The same person who wouldn't give me feedback to let me know how could I be successful, or the person who would give me demands, or expectations that weren't possible. I'd see one or the other, basically, in my hiring managers. And then with women, because I didn't have any close relationship with, either mother, and the relationship I had with my adoptive mother was, very abusive. I didn't have a lot of respect for women. I was either afraid of them if they were authority figures, or if they were peers, I just didn't trust them. And so I didn't have a lot of female friends. I didn't know how to keep them, if I made one. And in fact, all of my relationships were a little inside out. I would be super keen on meeting a new person, and I would give them 100% trust. I would never start neutral. I would give them 100%, and then they would just fail. They would let me down in some way, because we're all human. People let each other down. In a healthy relationship, you kind of start at neutral, and you work through trust, together, and that relationship either grows, or, maybe it just kind of stays in acquaintance space. That's healthy. When you have a close relationship, if somebody, betrays you or disappoints you, you talk about it and you make it right. I didn't know how to do that because I'd never seen it. I'd never seen it. So when I would have, even work relationships, I would be really uncomfortable, especially with the women that I worked around or worked with directly. It was very difficult for me to have a nice, even, calm relationship with a coworker, because if they did something that wasn't right and it impacted me in some way as an employee, I would treat them the same way that my mother would treat me, which wasn't very nice, but it was all I'd ever seen. It wasn't until maybe my late 20s where I started to see the pattern and realize that the pattern was me, and then started working on that, which, it took a long time to work those things out.
I'm always brought back to an old, well, you mentioned having been adopted in the 70s. So I would assume that you probably know some of the same things that I do. Like, you remember the old funny pages, right?
Of course.
The newspaper, right? And there was the Beetle and Bailey cartoon, and there's one that has always stuck with me, and where, I think it was the private who's talking to the sergeant, and he says, "Sergeant, we have found the problem, and he is us." So what helped you find that point where you realized that the problem was probably sitting right between your ears? And it was time to make some changes to that.
Well, so I was in my late 20s. I had a failed marriage. I had failed relationships before that marriage. I had a string of jobs where I was making really good money. And I had the skills and aptitude to be extremely successful, but I could never quite get out of my own way, and really be a top performer. And not that being a top performer is a way to measure ourselves, but I knew I had that capability and I just wasn't getting there. So it was basically a pattern in my personal relationships, a pattern at work. And also I still had this raging eating disorder, and very few close friends that I could trust. So what was going well? I also didn't have a family that was very supportive. So I didn't have really anything going for me. And I was still kind of suicidal. I was definitely depressed. And I started to seek therapy and help for it. And fortunately, at that point, that was something that was covered by insurance. I think, it was pretty recent that you could actually get talk therapy. Before then, it was something that only, in my opinion, like rich people could afford. And I wasn't one of them. So how do you get help? So I started looking for help, and I started looking for help with the eating disorder because, in terms of like what was the most acute problem in my life, it was that. I mean, it's a major health problem. It can cause and has caused for me health issues that, can carry on for the rest of your life, even after leaving the eating disorder behind. But what I found is that none of the therapists that I met with were really equipped to handle something that with that level of depth or intensity. They were maybe equipped to handle a teenager who was sort of experimenting with it, but they were not equipped to handle someone who at this point, had had one in my late 20s, I'd had an eating disorder for, like 13, 14 years. They just weren't equipped. And so I would go in and out of therapy. And it wasn't until I was in my early 30s where I just kind of had a breakdown and I couldn't take another day of work, and I was feeling kind of suicidal for two reasons. I never thought I would actually go through with it, but because now to get care, you had to get on waiting lists, long waiting lists, like 6 months long. And every time I would call to check to see where I was on the waiting list, wait a month and call, I was still just as far down below the line as I was when I first signed up on that waiting list. And so one day I called and I was expressing my frustration, why can't I get up higher on the list? And the person that spoke to me advised me that if I threatened to harm myself, I would be able to get care.
Wow.
So I did that. And what happened from that was I was placed with a therapist who immediately put me on disability. And I had short-term disability through my job. I was working for at the time, and I had a security clearance. I didn't know until afterward that status of my mental health would affect my security clearance, which it did. I was still able to work with customers, but not in the same way, after that. But anyway, I went on disability, and then I was offered to go into an eating disorder program, but it was inpatient. Insurance paid for like a tenth of it, and there was no way, on my reduced disability pay that I would be able to cover that and my expenses. I wasn't living with anybody. I didn't have anyone. So I decided not to do that. But as soon as I went on disability, I felt immediately lighter. And I started to realize some things about my life, that a lot of the choices that I made, which was, to basically choose the paycheck size over, what it was that I was actually doing for a paycheck, was probably not very good, and was probably contributing to the stress that, was fueling this raging eating disorder. And then we sort of worked backward, me and the therapist. We started with what was going on right now and what was contributing stress. And we eliminated that stuff. I mean, I would still have to go back to work, but at least for that, I think it was maybe 12 or 14 weeks, something like that, I was able to not have to work, and go through this program. I felt so much better. And so in that time, we just did a lot of therapy and worked back. And that's when I started to realize that all the stuff that happened to me in childhood was the problem. Now, it should be obvious to anybody who's reading this or hearing this going, well, duh, you've had these problems the whole time. But in the moment when somebody says, oh, you have a lot of stress, I would just deny it because I had a good job. I had a stable, income. I had my own place and I was, living okay. I was able to cook and clean and clothe myself and, exist in society as a contributing member. What stress did I have? But it was all these things that had built up over the years that I hadn't processed. All of these feelings that were so intense that I had felt for decades, almost 2 decades from birth until I left that household, just solid stress. And my way of dealing with that, with the, emotional abuse, with the physical abuse, with the sexual abuse, all of that trauma it was so intense that I would leave my body. I would dissociate. And then when I would come back to my body, the only pleasure that I was really allowed in that household was food. It was the only nice thing I was really allowed to have. I wasn't allowed to have any nice clothes, any nice time, any nice, experiences, just food. So I was only able to really obtain a sense of pleasure by, the texture and taste of something when I was eating it. So it took a while to unwind all of that. I mean, certainly those 3 months was not enough time, but it gave me enough exposure to the fact that I wasn't doing the kind of work I should have been doing. I'd never seen a good relationship. I really had received a lot of mistreatment and neglect and abuse that I didn't deserve. And there I was, and I understood that it was up to me to deal with it. Because even though I didn't do those things to myself, to give that depression to myself or give that trauma to myself, as an adult, I'm the one that's responsible for dealing with how I interact with the world. And so I went on a pretty long journey to figure out how to unwind that. And, it came out in a lot of different ways. I had to find some healthy channels to release the stress that I had. And I had to find some ways to process all of those emotions that I had refused to feel for so long.
It's funny, funny you talk about dissociation. I'm a semi-pro at that myself, and I have one of our kids who we've adopted. It's kind of a familial placement. I say kind of because not technically through blood, but families today have so much halves and steps, and so yeah, that's how we came to know this little guy. And we've known him since birth. As a matter of fact, my wife was the other person in the hospital room when he was born. So he's always been part of our life. But that's, he spent his first year of life in some really challenging circumstances. And he's dealt with a lot of dissociation. And oh my gosh, we have been like play therapy. All I can say is Miss Becky has been a wonderful addition to our team. She has helped so much and given us so many tools. And I'm so thankful that we found that for him at an early age, because he's still dealing with some of that stuff. But we have tools to help him work through it. And hopefully, he'll by the time he gets to adulthood, he'll have worked through a lot of that stuff on that long road so that he's not faced with that, because it's so true that stuff comes back from your childhood into your adult life. And it's not until you hit, I think, close to 40 before you realize, oh yeah, I do some of this stupid stuff, because this is what I remember from my own childhood. I was the dad I was at 20 years old to my older kids, because that reminded me of who my dad was. That was how you were dad. And don't get me wrong, me and my dad had a great relationship, and he passed a few years ago. And we had a great relationship, but there is parts of the way that he was a dad that I tried to do the same thing, and it was a horrible idea. It was probably not the best idea when he did it either, but he He didn't have a dad of his own that showed up in the house. His dad passed when he was very young, and he had some unhealthy male influences in his life that he dealt with. And you see these things that become generational if you're not intentional about realizing, hey, there's some stuff here. And then choosing to accept the responsibility to do the hard work to overcome that. And then when when and if you move on through your life and become parents of your own, like suddenly you can be such a different parent. And the most obvious example of that in our house was one day, my little guy, one of my youngest boys, he was having a meltdown, and he has those from time to time, and I've gotten pretty good with him. And I called him into my office here, and I lowered my seat, and I lowered my voice, and I slowed my cadence, and I took some deep breaths in the middle of the conversation just to kind of get those mirror neurons firing. And I got him calmed down in about 30 seconds, which for a kid he has a pretty impressive case of ADHD. To get him calm in 30 seconds, I'm just going to say it was amazing to watch that happen, because I was impressed with that one. And he calms down. We talk through whatever it was, because I'm certain it was over something super important. Like I was sitting there and then he came and stole my seat. It was something like that. Right. And so he gets calmed down, and all right, dude, he thanks for talking to me. Give him knuckles. Boom. All right. He runs off to the other room, happy and healthy and all that. And my oldest son, who at the time was probably about 22 years old, he looks at me, where the hell was this guy when I was that age? And I'm like, you were still building him. I was busy doing stupid mistakes. I'm like, and at that point, I think it's where he finally started to realize, because I'm like, you have to realize, dude, I was your age when you were his age. We were parents young, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was just a lost dummy trying to struggle my way through. And it wasn't until we've stepped into this world where you begin to understand trauma, and you begin to understand how it affects the brain and how it changes the thought patterns. And no, it's not choices to be the a-hole in the room, but it's literally the trauma taking over, and your brain is trying to protect you, and you do stupid stuff. And if you're a guy who's had some of that, or a woman who's had some of your own traumas, man, that when your kid acts out that way, you're going to step into your trauma space while they're in their trauma place, and we're going to go have a horrible time together. And it's taken a lot of years to get to where I know how to handle that so much better. But honestly, I credit a lot of it, and I talk about him on here from time to time. But Dr. Tom he's my guy. He's the guy who knows all the crazy of my life. And without that, I don't know that we would be the parents that we are today, because he has helped us understand and unpack so much of that trauma, and then become parents who can take care of kids in a healthy way. And so good on you for taking that time to realize there's some stuff there, and then being willing to do the work, because that's the key component. You're willing to do the work. And whether you become a parent to 25 kids or none, and and you're a friend to some people in your life that need a good friend, whatever it is, you will impact the world greatly just by having done the hard work.
Yeah, I had this mentor called Neil Kramer. He would say this thing, and it's stayed with me for years now, that there are two types of people: the willing and the unwilling. And sometimes in the moment when it's hard to go on, we have to remember who we are. And I'm one of the willing. Right? That's how we keep it going. Yeah.
That identity piece is huge. Who you choose, who you say you are. My wife for years was, I suck at math. That's what she'd tell you. And still today, she'll tell you that. And she has the advantage of having me in her life, because when we did homeschool some of our kids years ago, like I was the math guy. I'm the one who took calculus in high school because I thought it was fun. Right. I took Calc 2 in college because I thought it was fun and it was interesting. And so I'm the weird guy who loved math. But my wife would always tell you that she's not good at math. And it's funny to watch her. She'll walk in the grocery store and she'll tell you which one is the better buy as she does the math in her head. But because she says that she's not math isn't her thing, she's not a math person, she'll tell you she doesn't know how to do it, when I can watch her do it sometimes. But that consistent telling yourself over time, that that's not who you are, it changes how you show up in a lot of relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
With math, it doesn't matter, but there's so much of the relationship stuff that does matter.
It does matter with math too. All the stories that we tell ourselves, they become true. I mean, words basically, they take our thoughts and put them in motion, and then they do impact our actions. So if I say I'm willing, that impacts, if I think I'm willing and I say I'm willing, then that impacts my actions, and I go and I do whatever it is that I need to do to get out of whatever situation I'm in. I see people that are very attached to negative stories almost anywhere you go on social media. I see it all the time. One of the things that I do in my business is I help people to release stress so that they just have more room to deal with life. And I find a lot of people who say they have ADHD, they don't have a diagnosis. They haven't been to the doctor, but they say, my ADD, I can't do this because my ADD. I can't do that because my ADD, or I do all these things wrong because my ADD. And this is just an example, so it's not limited to someone who may or may not have ADHD, but I think it's a relatable story. I can't find my keys because my ADD. I can't find my phone because my ADD. And I just think, gosh, isn't it just more a case of like your cup is full and you don't have room for short-term memory? When we don't process our emotions, even from the little everyday stresses, like getting a phone call when we are not expecting it and don't have time for it, that's just a little bit of stress, right? Or maybe, spilling something when we're cooking dinner, just a tiny bit of stress. If we deal with it by getting angry and pushing it aside, or if we don't process it at all and just ignore it and let it worm into us and bother us, eventually the amount of room that we have for this, we run out. We don't have an unlimited space for this. So then what happens? The next stressor comes up, be it big or small. We know what the healthy response is, but what happens? That fight or flight takes place, doesn't it? That is it the amygdala, right? The lizard brain, right? That takes over because there's not room for our conscious mind to take that information in, like, here's a situation, and process it and respond to that in a healthy manner. We just react, right? Just boom. I have a theory that this might be the cause of a lot of the problems that people think that they have, these diagnoses that we apply to ourselves when we haven't been evaluated by a medical professional. It's just a theory, but I see this pattern really quite often. And I just wonder if we didn't take more time, or if we took more time to just process our emotions. Doesn't mean sitting and stewing in them, but just process, like, hey, I spilled some stuff on the counter and I was mad for a moment, but then I wiped it up and I moved on. If we took more time to just experience that moment, how much more time would we have? How much more space would we have to have healthy responses to situations, And then when something big comes up, like right now in our family, we've got 3 out of 4 parents are basically in critical care, right? So it's a stressful time, and we're not even the ones in the care, but we're worried about the legal issues and making sure that the doctors are taking proper care, that they have everything that they need, that, they're not feeling sad and lonely. Like, we're concerned, and it takes up a lot of our space. And I caught myself getting stressed and responding to someone in an unhealthy way. Someone gave me some feedback. It was just healthy feedback about my business, saying, hey, you did this thing for me and I really liked it. And I was wondering, could you add this at the end of the service? It was a really nice suggestion. But instead of hearing it and processing it in the moment and saying, oh, that's a really good idea. Or even if I didn't like it, to say, well, I'll think about it. My response was to push it away, to fight that honest and kind feedback. And so that was a note to me that, hey, my cup's probably running over and I need to take a few minutes and figure out, how am I going to release this stress? I think it's a life skill that we really should have. And I wish they taught that, in kindergarten. Maybe someday. Maybe someday. They might do that in, some of the private schools, but I don't think it's happening in public school.
No, I don't think it is either. But and that's a great point, because that is, I have that life where my bandwidth is, I run at about 120% of my bandwidth on a regular basis, and that's over time that causes problems, and you have to be aware of that. And I think the fact that you're aware of that is just amazing, because, man, it took me years to understand any of this stuff even made any sense at all. And as I've processed through it, I realized, yeah, I got a lot of stuff to work on still here. And sometimes I need to say the word no. And funny, because I've preached this message to guys in the past, like, who are talking about, I don't have time for this, and so wants me to do that. I have a buddy of mine who he works on cars, that's like his hobby. And so he has all kinds of people around him who'll bring their cars to him to work on them. This is not his job. He is not making money working on cars. He's doing it as a kindness to people. And I'm like, dude, you need to learn the power of the ancient words. You take the tip of your tongue and press it against the front of the roof of your mouth, and you press it in. And then as you release it, make that O sound. Go, no, that's the ancient word. It's the most powerful one of all. And as I'm preaching, I'm like, I don't even follow my own advice here. I know I don't. I struggle through it too. And I just keep adding to that. And sometimes you're going to find out that you're at the edge of your bandwidth. You can no longer operate. You get that blue screen of death that Windows Millennium Edition would give you all the time, and you get to that place where you lock up, and the people around you have to deal with the aftermath of that. And it's taken quite a few years of getting to that point where I'm comfortable with, even in my job, I tell them no on a regular basis, and they do not like it. And I've stopped caring that they don't like it. I can give you so much time. I can give you 12 hours a day, maybe. I can't give you 14 or 16. I have too many other things in my life. I have a house full of kids. I have a medically fragile newborn in my house. Well, technically not a newborn anymore. I think she's almost 5 months old. But I've got a lot of stuff going on, and all of it's more important than your stuff, people. And I'm sorry that doesn't line up with your wants and desires, but your wants and desires are not my responsibility. And it took a lot of years to get to where I was comfortable saying that. And it turns out, even when I say no, I'm still employed at the same place. Been there for 15 years. They don't like it that I'm not willing to give them 16 hours sometimes, but that's what I need to do. And I have to take stock on that. So you've learned all this stuff in your life. So where has it brought you to now? Where are you at now with your, with your life, with your family, your career, and where you stand? And even with your, the adoptive and bio family that you had, where do you stand with all that now?
Well, as far as with my adoptive family, my adoptive father passed away in 2009, Christmas 2009. So he's no longer with us. My adoptive mother, she's, we're estranged. I've tried to repair that relationship, but what is a nice way to put, how shall I put this? To this day, she's never dealt with how she got to be so sad, abusive, emotionally repressive, and she's, refuses to look at it. She's one of the unwilling. So, in order to have a conversation with her, I have to be willing to entertain her delusions. And I don't make a lot of space to put up with that. So we don't speak very often. I would say we're estranged. Yeah. My birth mother, we're fairly close. We speak every week. I spent Thanksgiving with them this past one, with her and her husband, and they're very good people. She's a great lady. Really glad that she wanted to be found. I found her through an adoption search angel. That's a whole story in itself. And then my biological father is still struggling with drugs and alcohol. So he'll call every once in a while, but he's always high. So, the conversations aren't very good, or he's either drunk or high. So he'll either call from the bar, say hello, it's dad, and then pass the phone around to the people at the bar, some strangers that I don't know, which is, I don't always want to hear that. Or he'll just be, completely high and won't, it'll be word salad. So, yeah, I would say we're not close. The door is open. Definitely the door is open. Same with my adoptive mom, the door is open. But I do expect to have an adult civil conversation, and that's not really possible with those two.
Yeah. Do you have are you married? Do you have children of your own, or
Yeah.
is that part of your journey?
Yeah, I've been with my partner for 7 years. He has a son. So I haven't had children. I haven't actually been able to have children biologically. So at this point in life, I'm pretty much given up on that, and that's okay. And then as far as where I've taken this, I basically took some of the skills that I built, which were, I suppose, survival coping mechanisms, which had been the dissociation, and then also just the mental flexibility that it takes to grow up in a household where people say things, but then their intentions and actions don't align with them. Growing up like that, I had to kind of develop, well, these are innate skills that all humans have, but we're constantly bombarded with signals. So we only process so many signals per second. I worked really hard to flex the muscles that would allow me to calculate whether someone's words and intentions were aligned with what their actions were going to be. So it makes it very easy for me to read people, in person, which is helpful in careers such as sales, and also, working for alphabet agencies, but that is not my jam. So how I've used it is I help people who don't or are unwilling. They don't want to or are unwilling to empty their stress cup on their own. I do that for people. So I do that with sound healing. I use tuning forks. I go into their field. I usually do it virtually. So I do it over Zoom. I can go in and find areas of stress and kind of read it. When I use a fork, it has a coherent, consistent sound. So I know you know some things about audio and music, so you probably understand this. I'll come into someone's field with a tuning fork. Let's say it's 144 hertz, and that's got a consistent tone. And when I bring that into the field, we release standing waves off of our body with our thoughts and our emotions. When we release waves that don't fully process, so an emotion that we experienced in the moment but didn't want to feel, they get stuck in our field and they are incoherent. So it's if you look at it as a waveform, like it's a mess. It's not a nice, it's not like a snowflake. If you saw, an image of it, it's a mess. So when I come into the field with a coherent sound, any areas in the field that are also coherent, there's just a nice harmonization. It sounds nice. When I run into something incoherent, the fork will either throw off overtones or undertones, depending on what's in that junk that they didn't want to feel. So for example, if it's alarm or fear, that's a higher frequency pitch. So it'll release an overtone off of the fork, so harmonic. And if it's something, depressed, sad, very low, also kind of indulgent low feelings like sexual desires, things like that are unfulfilled will also come in at low frequencies. And so there will be an undertone that comes off of the fork, something lower. So if it's 144 hertz, it would be a lower harmonic that comes off. There's also a feeling in the fork that when I hold it, it will have like a grindy feeling or a staticky feeling or some sort of sensation that is not, I know this is something that person doesn't want. And there's also resistance. We have an electromagnetic field around us. I don't know if you know this, but we do. And in that field, the fork kind of acts like a magnet. And when it runs into something unprocessed, it'll stop. And the reason I do this work is that in order to work in someone's field, I have to be able to step out of my own. And having dissociated for, so much of my life, it's very easy for me to do this. And the term for that is called, in martial arts, would be hollow bone. I don't know if you've heard this term before, but anyone who's done martial arts is probably familiar with it, where you really have to sort of listen to what the other person is doing. What is your attacker doing, and feel for that. So even if someone comes up behind you, you know that they were there. It's the same idea. Dissociating is that I'm not paying attention to my own body's emotions or thoughts or sensations. I am feeling theirs. So I can kind of read their life from the outside in, like a record with a fork when I use that. And it helps me to, find things that people have had often early in life, whether they were aware of it or, had been aware at the time but forgot. I can find it and say, oh, hey, around 7, so you got hit in the head, and maybe did you have a concussion? Were you unconscious? Did something happen? And it can come to their mind. They don't have to tell me about it. They can, but I'm not a therapist of that kind. So they don't have to go into their story if they don't want to, but it comes to mind, and they'll either have a body sensation or a thought. They might see something in their mind's eye, kind of a memory. And I just hang out with that until that incoherence dissolves. And once that dissolves, then that releases any tension that was holding on to it. And then that gives them an opportunity to have more space in that cup, So I basically go through and do that for people. And then once they've released that stress, they're able to just go right back to life. So it works really well if someone's also in therapy, because they have someone that they can talk to about their stories. But even just for everyday things, the stress of new parenthood, for example, or bereavement, or being in a really chaotic environment, sometimes work environments especially, there's so many inputs that can be overwhelming to people. So it's a way to just kind of maintain that. And it's a good option for people that haven't, learned how to release stress in other ways.
Wow, I've never heard of that. What's that field called?
Oh, well, it's sound healing. I personally use tuning forks. So I go through a modality called biofield tuning. And the reason I chose that modality is that it did have a certification method, and it follows the science of electric universe theory. So it gives me a scientific approach that I can use. There are other sound healing modalities, and truth be told, they all work. It's really a matter of finding a practitioner that you can work with. So you may have heard of sound baths. That's another way. Or even light therapy is also vibrational. You wouldn't hear the light rays there, but that too have a frequency for our ears to pick up. But that is another method that can be used. But by doing it through biofield tuning, we don't have to get spiritual. I'm not afraid of spiritual, but not everyone is comfortable with that type of an approach. And I really wanted to bring something to someone who hadn't already been in a long spiritual journey. I wished I'd had something like that when I was first trying to figure out where all my stress was coming from, especially when I was working with those therapists who weren't really equipped to deal with the deep stuff that I had. But I knew that they could help me develop healthy responses to everyday things. So once that stress cup is empty, there's room for those healthy responses that we learn. I think anybody who goes through therapy, and most people get an opportunity to do it at some point in their life, either through bereavement or even going into marriage counseling. There's some of that, or even before getting married. Sometimes there's depending on the person who marries you, they may have some requirement to have some therapy, and usually they'll cover healthy mechanisms. And so everybody thinks, well, I know the healthy way to respond to this or that. But then in the moment, are they really using those healthy things? So that was my goal. It's just to help people have, a nicer, more graceful life experience without having to be someone who administers drugs or, had to go to school for another 20 years. Because at that point in my life, once I learned how to do it, it was like, I don't have time to go to school for another, 10 years in order to be like a doctor. So what can I do that would be helpful without having to go, invest a huge chunk of my life into re-education? So I chose that.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I have not actually heard of that, and all I can say is, we have lots and lots of unprocessed trauma in our house. But right now we're down to 5 kids in the house, and all 5 of them come from trauma.
Yeah. That's a lot to take on. Yeah.
Some days it's more than I thought I ever could, but God has a weird way of handing you things that you will learn to handle. Maybe I'm pretty certain I wasn't prepared at the beginning of all this, but I've learned so much, and it's a lot of stuff that we don't understand, and we just sometimes you just move through it the best you can, and that's where we've been. But that trauma piece, that's an interesting approach to it. I've never heard of sound healing before, so that'll probably end up in my Google search history in the near future.
I'll send you some links if you like.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, because
Yeah.
like I said, I come from a weird place. My wife has, came from a totally different traumatic background, and then every one of our kids came to us through some form of trauma in their life or another. And that's just who we are. We're the trauma house. And so, the police department knows us well, the school administrators know us well. And I spent 45 minutes one day educating one of my kids' teachers on like the trauma that we deal with on a daily basis, and here's what you're seeing in class, here's why you see this, and here's how you can affect this. And the interesting thing was, as I talked with her, she, and this is a gal who's been teaching long, she's getting ready to retire, and she says, oh, I understand all about trauma, and I'm certain she's had a very intellectual explanation, and because a lot of teachers get taught that. But then she mentioned how, right now I'm in a hard place because this is the anniversary of my son's death. And I'm like, oh, so like you're dealing with kids in their own trauma while you're still dealing with your own trauma. And I get it. I'm not mad at you, but you have to understand every little thing that you do here affects these kids in a way that you may not expect. And that's why you're seeing the reaction you're seeing. And this teacher, who's been a teacher long enough to retire from the profession, goes, oh, I never really thought that my actions might be affecting all the kids in class. And I'm like, really? You never thought that thought? Because I know that my actions do that in the house, and I'm not a teacher, but she was in her own trauma space and working through something. So it was an interesting conversation to have with an educator who's struggling in that, herself as somebody who's lived enough life to be ready to retire. I don't know exactly how old she is, and I don't want to guess just in case she ever listens to this, because I really don't know how old she is, but she's, she, like most of us, was probably never introduced to this stuff, very early in life, and hasn't had a whole lot of time to learn about it.
If someone were developing an education program for educators that actually equipped them to have the tools that they needed to be successful, wouldn't you think that understanding trauma would be one of those things that they would be introduced to? It's almost like I learned recently that medical doctors, receive little to no education on nutrition. That blows my mind,
Mm-hmm.
So it's the education system is it's a funny thing. I can't imagine. I mean, I would think an educator would have put that education curriculum together, but then they didn't consider trauma. Think about how much stress that must also put on the teacher themselves. How are they going to process what comes up in class?
Absolutely. That's ironically, it's kind of ironic that you mentioned that, because it's something I'm looking into right now a little bit, of being able to, because you can get an education about trauma and how it affects people, a very clinical, fact-based, intellectual course, and you can learn a lot of facts, but it's not until you've seen it firsthand and been able to kind of live in it for a moment that you can truly begin to understand it. And I can say that because I got thrown into the deep end. The very, very first kids who ever came to our house had watched their father murdered. That was our first foster kids, right? That was the story of those kids. And I was not prepared to deal with that. We got thrown in the deep end, and we've been through many, many, many very difficult placements with kids, and I've had to learn this stuff. And I think part of the problem with this is that so many people have an intellectual knowledge, educators, and not to their fault, but it's just the system that we have. They have an intellectual knowledge at best. Very few of them have a real true experiential knowledge about what it really comes out looking like. And my little guy who, he is diagnosed ADHD, and I jokingly say sometimes like they're going to have a premium edition in the next DSM, and that's going to be like his. But you won't see ADHD in him that presents typically among most kids. He is not typically the hyperactive kid physically. Mentally, he is though. If you watch him and you watch his little brain, when it kicks into hyperdrive, look out. He might not look like the kid who is the standard diagnosed kid for that, but his little brain will run you right square over, and he can't stop and think. He hasn't gotten to that point. We've been working with him for a long time. We have therapists on board. I've people with letters after their names working to help him work through that, and we'll get there. But he's not there yet, and so many educators don't know what that looks like. And where it comes from and all the why. And I get it. It's not their fault that they haven't ended up in the weird world that I'm in. So obviously they're not going to have that knowledge.
Yeah. It's also, though, I think the other thing that's missing is compassion. And I think that's one of the reasons why I chose to work with people who've had trauma, is that it allows me to be around the people that I want to be around. Once you've gone through trauma and come out the other side, the level of compassion among those people is unbelievably high. And it is the EQ, the emotional quotient of people like that, even if they still have a full stress cup, is still incredibly high. And the amount of love and caring that people that have been through that is phenomenal. And for anyone who hasn't been through that, I wouldn't wish trauma on anyone. But at the same time, I hope everyone has a chance to have someone like that that's been through it and come out the other side in their life. I think we see a lot of that in, if we look at in the spiritual community, I think most houses of spirit, either churches or I'm not going to put any flavors on that, typically have someone who's been through a lot or have witnessed a lot through their congregation or through their group of people. But if you don't have spirituality, I hope you at least have someone like that in your life. And I hope teachers find someone like that too. If they're not spiritual, if they can have someone that can introduce them to compassion and to witnessing what someone goes through on the other side of trauma.
Absolutely. Well, Michelle, I appreciate your time today. I really do. It's been a great conversation, and not many people walk through the hard traumas that you've talked about and have come out quite as far ahead as you have, because not only have you come through your traumas and worked through that, but you've chosen to work in the field where you help people with their trauma. And that's such a beneficial thing for people to know that, hey, I'm not the only one, I'm not crazy because I'm dealing with this.
Nobody's alone in this. No one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, Foster Care Nation, thank you for listening to Michelle's story. Now take her knowledge and wisdom to heart so you can create love and healing in your family and community. Be sure to come back next week. We have episodes show up every Tuesday. If you'd like to share your story as a guest, you can reach us at jason@fostercarenation.com. You can connect with other like-minded people on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/fostercareuj. And don't forget, we have an account at Buy Me a Coffee. It's like a virtual tip jar where you can help us fund our mission for as little or as much as you want. It's at buymeacoffee.com/fostercare. The links to everything is in the show notes on your podcast player or at fostercarenation.com. And as always,
You are so super awesome. I think you guys are cool. Yeah! Oh, yeah. Thank you for listening. Thanks.
Unparalleled Studios.
Studio.